Hello, friends. This is Talk, 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 and I am your host, Vivi Henriette. In today's episode, we talk to Stephen Rains, poet, educator, and author of one of my favorite books of poetry, A Quilt for David. This book came to me during an extremely difficult bout of insomnia, and I read it in one sitting, which says a lot for me because I am a slow reader. We get into this book in the following interview, and we also get into Stephen's lifelong love affair with the writer Anais Nin, whose foundation he's now president of. And we also get into Stephen's latest work for the Love of Peter Hujar, a zine dedicated to the life of the photographer Peter Hujar. With that, I hope you enjoy the interview. I certainly enjoyed making it. Talk, 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 talk. Art of the Zodiac presents Talk, 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 Talk.
Yeah, definitely. So when I was 15 years old, my friend Stephanie Recht, she gave me a copy of Delta Venus, and she said, "Put this in your bag. It's the best smut you'll ever read." And I don't even know how much smut I was reading before then, but it was so exciting to read Anais's Delta Venus. And for those who don't know, it was erotica that she wrote for $1 a page when her and her friends needed money, and there was so, and then later on in life, she chose to publish the erotica. So and it was published posthumously, and it was actually her only bestseller, which is quite interesting and also sad that she didn't get to see the attention that book received. But oh yeah, I was enthralled, and it was so exciting to be this like super horny 15-year-old, like reading all these great stories.
Yeah.
The book starts off with an introduction that's an excerpt from her published diary. And that haunted me more than any story in that book. And that introduction, she talks about, uh, the collector kept giving her feedback about leave out the poetry, and how
Mm.
it incensed her. And it actually kind of angered her. And then she started to feel sorry for him because this is a man who didn't understand that there's always different shades of color and light and smells, like
Yeah.
in sex, and how this is like a full experience. And I think I was kind of, I was in the Midwest living in such a black and white world, and there was something so haunting about what what I was reading, and I realized it was from a diary. So then I went to my public school library and looked for books, and they only had one, which was volume 4 of her published diary. And so that's how I started. I didn't even start at volume 1. I started at 4, and I read that, and then I went to, and read her whole diary series from then on. And her work, her diaries were then there were unexpurgated diaries that came out. So just when I had caught up, reading everything
Yeah.
by her, there was always this like new work coming out. And I think that when we study something deeply, there are a lot of universals. And
Yeah.
also she gave me this great kind of blueprint about how to live my life as an artist. And so a lot of like what I know of the world was through her. She documented everything. And so so much of the things I was introduced to are because of her writing and because of her life.
Wow. But you, besides just like reading all of it, you've spent time making your own like poetry around it, like response to it, and have spent a lot of time doing scholarship around her work. Am I
Yeah,
correct
yeah,
here?
you're
Yeah.
right. I actually have one poem called Anais Nin Never Bought a Car. And it's because when I was buying a car, I didn't know what to do. Like I didn't, like I was so nervous about like buying a car, and I thought like normally people go to their parents for these kinds of things, and that's not the relationship I have with my parents. So, and I thought like usually like when I had a question, it would kind of be this like, what would Anais do, or what did Anais
Yeah.
know? And for me, I was like, oh, well, she never bought a car. Like, how do I navigate through this? So that's the poem I have on her. Although years ago went to an event at the Hammer Museum for a writer I liked, and
Yeah.
I was so bored. I was so bored in the audience, and I thought, well, what, who wouldn't I be bored over? And I thought, oh, they should really do something for Anais. And I thought, well, I should organize it. So I organized Anais at 105. It was honoring her 105th birthday. And then that was the start of it. And I've organized several events since then. A few years ago, I got on the Anais Nin Foundation board. And for the almost a year now, I've been the president of the board. And so that's been great. And right now, I'm spending a lot of my time. She donated her archives to UCLA, and the last 15 years of her life aren't archived. I'm sorry, they're not in the archives.
Okay.
So I've been going through, like personally going through in a storage unit, all of her materials and preparing it to hopefully go into the UCLA archives. And if they're not interested, finding another archive that would be a suitable place for the remainder of her life's work.
Okay, this is wild. So you went from being 15 in like St. Louis, right? Where you grew up?
Yes.
Yeah. And like your friends, like, best smut you'll ever read. Here, take this book. And like fast forward a bunch of years, and you're the president of the foundation, and you're like the one who's in charge of going through her material to put into the archive. Did I just get that right?
Yes. Yeah, you got that trajectory. And actually, Stephanie Recht, who introduced me to Anais's writing, I still talk to like 2 or 3 times a week. And so like, going through the archives, sometimes I'll send her, but like I, like I'm touching her original diaries, I'm going
Yeah.
through correspondence. There's all these like medical bills and these personal photos. And, every now and then I'll just take a photo and send it to Stephanie. And I was like, look what you create, like, look what you started. Yeah.
Wow. And like that feels like enough to just be a career. Like if you're like, oh, this is like my achievement in life, that would feel big. But what I find so fascinating, one of the many things about you, is that you're technically, right, like not an academic. Like the only people I know who just spend a lot of time with dead people's material are academics. They have just like PhDs and they teach and they just do this stuff for, it's their life. But you're not. Like you're a therapist by profession, right? You chose and you have a whole other career.
Yeah. Yeah. So that started maybe 17 years ago, 16, 17 years ago. And what's nice for me is that I love it's a job I love. There's never
Mhm.
like a day where I'm like, oh, I have to work. I love the work and I love working with people, and it's a profession where I get to help people. It's also, it's nice that I have so many interests in my life and that I can do that. And, those are limited hours in my week I spend doing that. And then I have all this other time in my life that I can fill doing these kind of creative and artistic pursuits.
Yeah. And by the way, do you like my question style where I don't actually ask questions? I just throw things at you and expect you to like pick them up.
Oh,
Thank you for doing
yeah.
so well with that. I'm forming things here. Um, and this maybe goes back to the investigative poet. Just, I love this title. Or like I was thinking like, oh, Stephen's like the academic for the people, right? Because like academics, you don't usually have like, access to them. I don't know. They're at conferences and they're teaching and whatever. But this idea that you're like doing this purely out of love. And I also, your work is so accessible, right? The fact that you just released a zine, right? And so I guess I was thinking, was there like a conscious point for you of like, at some point in your career, like, oh, I could like go this sort of academic route, or like, I'm going to choose to do it this way? Was that a conscious choice?
Like there were several choices over time. I think one, in terms of accessible poetry, I'm not interested in elitism, and unfortunately the poetry world can, be saturated with it at times. And I love poetry. It's one of the great loves of my life. And I want more and more people to experience it. So why would I do anything that's going to exclude others from it? And I don't own poetry. I want everyone to own it.
Yeah.
Also, I don't, just probably personal taste, I don't like poems that feel like a riddle. Like I don't, like I'll seek something else out. What I want is when I was talking about that kind of like that truth or that meaning or something that resonates. That's really what just lights me up. And, I can read years ago, I remember reading, it was actually a short story by Mary Gaitskill, folk song, I think it's called 1999. And I read it before bed and I couldn't sleep because I just felt like I was vibrant. Like I was so, like I found this story like so energizing. And and that's true. Like that happens with poems all the time where it's just like I can read a good poem and it energizes me throughout the day. And it's truly, truly thrilling. Um, and I want everyone to kind of experience that. So
Y-
so there's that element to
Yeah.
it. I think also, I mean, having like a sense of playfulness and a sense of humor, and sometimes academia is void of that. Like when you mentioned the therapy work in school, people always, there was always this encouragement of like, who's your ideal client? Like, think about who your ideal client is. And for me, I was thinking like, how to distill information, how to distill things for people, like how to distill complexity for just something that's really accessible. Like it just even in the work that I do and in casual conversations, I use a lot of analogies,
Hmm.
you know, and oddly there's a lot of kitchen analogies about cooking and recipes and things like that. But I think it's a great way of relating to people. Um, Also, I really like people. I want people to have a good experience, and I think that's part of it too.
This is an ADHD tangent, but we'll go down a few of them. But do you cook a lot?
No, not at all. No, I have a meal service. Like I don't even like no. I go through a baking phase every now and then, but no, it's one of those activities that people can really, I think
Yeah.
that's why. Yeah, no, it works.
Well, my first experience with your work was A Quilt for David. In this, I'm doubting everything I say today. And I read that book like in the middle of the night. I had insomnia and I just in one sitting, which
Mm.
is it's just good for me because I'm a slow reader. But it was like both. I felt that energized. Like I was like, oh, this is so like sad and hopeful and exciting and also really easy to read. Like I appreciate the sort of prose poetry um style you have, but also the fact that like I know people spend decades working on books of poetry, right? Like that happens, but you spent like a decade working on this book of poetry because you were investigating, right? Like, do you want to talk a little bit about that process in that book for people who aren't familiar with it?
Yeah, so the book A Quilt for David, it was published by City Lights and it came out about 3 years ago today. I didn't realize that until someone reminded me. It's about a situation that happened in the early 90s where a young college woman came forward and she blamed her HIV infection on her dying dentist. And he died, and then eight others came forward and blamed their HIV infection on the dentist. And it really started this, like a media monster was born. And it really fed into this narrative of that scary time about HIV, like dirty HIV positive men infecting, innocent people. And there were even, there was even a narrative about him maliciously infecting people. There's a book dedicated to the concept that he was a serial killer. And I, just out of my own curiosity, I started kind of researching like, you know, I was, when I was 13 years old, I would watch Inside Edition and A Current Affair. I don't know if do you remember those shows?
Vaguely, but I feel like that's probably not healthy for the 13-year-old mind.
No, not at all, because it was like these tabloid journalism shows, but
Yeah.
it was the only time I saw gay people on TV. So I would watch them and they were like, stripper by day. I'm sorry, like car salesman by day, stripper by night. Like, it was this gay guy, and it was like so exciting to see. So I'd watch that, but that's where I first found out about the story about Kimberly Bergalis and then Barbara Webb and these people who were accusing the dentist. And I thought about it much later. And I thought, like, oh, how did he infect those patients? And that's how my research started. It was just my own curiosity. And it was clear that it was a situation that people didn't revisit with our current information about HIV transmission. Before I worked as a therapist, I worked for over 10 years doing HIV counseling and testing. So, and I was certified in two different states to provide counseling and testing. And
Yeah.
so I was super knowledgeable about transmission of the disease. And so I was like, you know what? I couldn't even conceive how that would happen. And that led to, like you said, over 15 years of my personally interviewing people, going through courthouse documents, and doing research at lots of different universities and archives, just with that question about, what happened. And I thought I was writing about what happened in that dental office, but what I was really doing is I was writing about what was happening in America at that time. It's just that the story is really a microcosm um, of what was happening all over America.
When I think of poetry, I always think of the subjective. But what's interesting about that, I mean, many things are interesting about that piece. But what's striking about that piece is you made sure that it's based on fact. You didn't take creative liberties with the story. Is that correct?
Yeah, you have such a good memory. I didn't want to, it's a situation just riddled with misinformation. And I didn't want to add to that with my own like poetic musings or any fictionalizing. I felt like I wanted people to have real information. And also, I think that truth is can be stranger than fiction. I think it's really telling. And it was a challenge as a poet. I didn't want to, have a Wikipedia entry with line breaks. I did want to, it was work. I sweated over that book. It was really a hard book. And the writing process took a while. And thankfully, I had a lot of people like the poet Colin Kelly and David Trinidad and I got input from friends like Tim Miller and Darren Klein to go over the work because it was so, I hadn't read anything like that before. I didn't know of work like that. And I just felt like it was really kind of on a path on my own of trying to do that with the work. So it's really meaningful to, when I hear people connecting with it and enjoying it and also learning from it.
We were talking about Anais. I'm not going to
Anais.
say it correctly.
It's
Anais.
Anna with Is at the end. Anais. Yeah.
Anais. Anais. Um, you were talking about what was it? Her erotica, where you said it was the person she was writing for was trying to get her to take the poetry out. Am I getting this correct?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that she was talking about her defense of poetry was like essentially like you need the sort of vividness of human life in there, right?
Yeah.
And so like coming to your piece, right? You this is a piece arguably that didn't need to be, right, poetry, right? Because it's not like it doesn't, I mean, yeah, it didn't arguably need to be a piece of poetry, but it did, right? And so my question is like, why was this a poem and not just like an essay or something pleading your case?
I didn't know what I was doing when I was reading. I was just following my own. It's as artists, what we do is you just follow an artistic impulse, and its cognition comes later. I thought I might actually write a nonfiction book about it. Although I would make a lot of copies and, and write notes in the margin. And sometimes those notes were even almost like poems themselves in those papers. And I also thought the situation was, in a way, the science, the data was always there. It's
Mhm.
just that people were overtaken with their emotional response to this woman who said she was a virgin and Americans love a virgin, like there's a narrative that they're working with there and then an older woman. And so they really just had an emotional response to it. They also had a hatred of gays. So it really suited them emotionally. And then I thought, poetry is the language of our emotions. What if I were able to utilize, like have poetry do the labor
Yeah.
that and give people an emotional experience of David's life and his struggles at that time.
I say this and I'm like, obviously you know this, like you achieved that. I'm laughing because like I don't have my copy on me because I gave it to my flatmate and I want like 10 more copies because I feel it's a book I would just like give to everybody I know. Like I'm just like, here, read this. I was like the morning after I finished, I was like, someone else needs to read this. It's so good. That's my review.
Thank you. Here, I have it here. I'm actually so pleased that David's on the cover and that I that through the book people get to visually see David.
Yeah.
There aren't a lot of public images. This was one that actually wasn't public. It was a bit of a challenge to track down, but that he's there and he's smiling. He's a young man smiling on the cover, and so people can just kind of have a sense of him.
And were his parents still alive by the time when because you went down to Florida to do the research, right?
Sadly, when I first started doing my research, I found a number and an address for his mom,
Okay.
and I couldn't imagine she would have still been alive. And I called the number and she answered. And we talked very briefly. And she said just that she was unwilling to talk. And so
Mm-hmm.
it was always my hope that she would be able to read the book. And unfortunately, she passed before the book came out. But that was always something I thought, like, how, what a rewarding experience it might have been for her to see someone, making attempts to rewrite the narrative about her son's life. What happened to David could happen to any of us, which is someone points a finger at us, and it changes the trajectory or the legacy or our legacy. And that can really happen to any of us. So that was another thing too. Like all this work was this like loving act towards someone I didn't even know, but it's
Yeah.
what I would want someone to do for anyone that I love and care about.
You you put an ad in the newspaper, which is something that I don't know if people do anymore. Like you were probably like the last of that. Can you speak to
Yeah.
that?
So I really, after doing so much research and reading all these articles, I really wanted to talk to patients of David's, friends, family, loved ones. And because of his age, at what his age would have been at that time, like who his colleagues would have been, I I thought like reaching out online, like they might not have internet or they might not be
Yeah.
very skilled. And so I thought, oh, I'll just place an ad in the paper. So I had a photo of David and I said, looking to speak to, patients, friends, family members of David Acker. And like I was saying about email, I had my email address
Yeah.
and I also just put my phone number because I thought not everyone has email address. If he had an older patient, then they would have been in their 80s at that time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had and my phone rang quite often. So
Was this the early 2000s?
yes. Oh, hold on, let me think. Yeah, no, no, 2008. I actually have the exact date of when I started doing research. But I don't know offhand right now in terms of remembering it. But
Okay.
what was also interesting and telling is I had a lot of people calling me asking about why I was interested in knowing more information about a killer. Also, I had a lot of people giving me their opinion, and they didn't know him. They weren't like involved in any way, like in terms of being like investigators. They didn't even live in the area at that time. So these are people who were just going on like the lore and all the misinformation that just keeps getting repeated. The first accuser, Kimberly Bergalis, is, can like was considered a hero at that time, or that, such a victim. There's a beach named after her. She has a large like memorial tree. There's a bronze statue, like a life-size bronze statue. She has four panels on the AIDS quilt. There's and there's some things I'm forgetting right now, but she really was, you know, held in high regard. And it there are a lot of things she said that appear to not be true.
Yeah.
including her virginity. So, those things that weren't revealed over time. And there's also the financial incentive of money. All of, the first batch of accusers, I'll say, received a lot of money. They sued the insurance company, his malpractice insurance, and they sued the insurance company that referred them to David's office. So they made millions from these accusations.
You've mentioned before, and just in conversation, um, your own struggles growing up, like not fitting in, right? You grew up in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that both Anais and David are characters that come out of your own youth. In both cases, do you think that there's something about like researching their lives that's also sort of cathartic for you? Or like, is it also like sort of an investigation or some sort of work around your own teenage experience?
Wow, that is such a great question. And I hadn't ever even thought about it. Yes, is the immediate answer. And and it kind of goes to this fascination I have about how, like queer people at a young age are kind of drawn to other queer people, or that we all have the same kind of, I had very uh original interests, for like a young boy, that I liked Cass Elliot, I liked Mama Cass, from the
Yeah.
Mamas and the Papas. And what is it about her that was so appealing to me at a young age? Or who were some of the other? I liked Phyllis Diller. Um, like these kind of things, like these kind of like in a way like gay icons of sorts. But yeah, that I think we just have an attraction um to outsiders, or
Yeah.
people who are confident in their eccentricity. And I think that they really offer us a model of
Hmm.
that, or, they give us hope that there's some kind of
Yeah.
possibility. Like, why do gay men like divas so much? Like, why do they like that, like, outspoken woman? And I think it's because it's like, oh, I can be that person too. And and I wonder if that's going to change over time as we have more outspoken gay men now, where
Yeah.
before we just had women. But you have a good point. Like, and like, what is that about that I go to those things? I
Like I'm
also,
almost wondering, oh, sorry,
go
go
on.
on. Like if it was somehow like going to Florida and being around like getting these phone calls that sound quite disturbing, right? Like why are you researching a killer, et cetera, writing about? Like did it feel when that book came out that it was like a win for David, but also somehow a win for you, right? There was like a
I was happy I was really happy that it was at City Lights,
yeah.
to work so hard and be with such a prestigious press. That was a dream come true. And they were so lovely to work with. Like, there was never one moment where I was like, oh, they were just such consummate professionals. And just, I mean, if anyone could, be published with them, do it. I would say, like,
Yeah.
I would jump to do it again. They were so, so lovely. So that did feel like a win, is that I created something that was desirable to this publisher. And I did feel like it was a win for David because people started talking about him again, and that I was giving like another narrative about the situation. It's what I always wanted. Is I wanted people to revisit the situation. And a lot of people do remember this situation. Like, it's, that it was, she was on the cover of People magazine at one point, like, just
Yeah.
People Weekly, that, the number one magazine, that she was on the cover, and an article dedicated to her and what she was and what Kimberly was doing. So it was a really big story at that time. And the CDC did research on it, and they didn't come to any conclusive results. But the CDC, though, never even talked to a sex partner of David's. And yet through my research, I was able to find a sex partner of David's and talk with him. So, me with like limited resources for this, like that I'm finding sex partners like, and the CDC wasn't. And that just says, it just shows like how mishandled things were at that time.
Um, okay. This coming to the latest work. There's a piece in there where you're talking about yourself, but it's so like straightforward. And for a moment, I get lost. Remember reading it and almost getting lost in it. I was like, oh, is this like how's Peter talking? And then I was like, oh, but this is Stephen talking. And then there was this moment of like you were just like shared your really like personal, intimate experience or something like really raw. And it just served to like, oh, like somehow I feel closer to Peter in this book.
Hmm.
Do you remember the part I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. You're such a smart reader. I think it's probably page 4 with the art on it. Actually, if you're looking for the image. Yeah,
Thank you.
because part of it
Yes.
was
Yes, it was. Page 4.
when you hand make a book, the pages. The Mattazine Society, they have a series called For the Love of,
Yeah.
and they've published books for the love of Cookie Mueller, for the love of Joe D'Alessandro, for the love of Dennis Cooper was their first one. And they actually approached me and asked if I wanted to do a book for the love of Anais Nin. And I was flattered. It was a smart idea. And I thought, well, I would really like to do one on Peter Hujar. And they
Yeah.
loved the idea. So that's how it started. The zine started, and I'm the first person to write for, I'm their first kind of guest writer.
Yeah.
And in the process of just writing out the things I wanted to say about Peter, it was like, well, what is this interest in Peter? Like, why do I have such a, like, where's this connection or what is it? Like, why am I so drawn to this person who would have been 90 on
Mhm.
October 11th coming up? And I think part of it is sharing a similarity of having very critical moms and growing up in abusive households. And, let me pull up the quote because it's so heartbreaking that one of David's best friends was Fran Lebowitz. And she talked about David. I'm sorry, she talked about Peter. So Fran was talking about Peter Hujar, and she said, waiting for Peter to get dressed um, was like waiting for a model to get dressed. It was not vanity, it was the opposite. It was fear. And my younger self really related to that in terms of, um, growing up with such like criticism, whether it was like in the house I grew up in or then like in school and receiving it socially, that and I look back at photos of myself, I was like, oh, there was nothing wrong with me, you
Yeah.
know, and so there's something for Peter too, like just kind of identifying with that about how like that's a shared experience. Also, I think there's a way of, telling the story. Like in a way, it is for the love of Peter Hujar, but it lets the reader know like what's my interest in it, like what's at stake here. So it's not like a Sermon on the Mount. It's not like being professorial,
Hmm.
kind of talking about like relating and ways that we relate.
Yeah. And what I loved about that quote, because I've just been thinking, it's the thing that really stuck with me. I mean, a lot did from that zine, but the way in which it really served to get us closer to Peter, right? Like it didn't feel like an interruption, right? Sometimes people could be like, "Oh, I'm writing about this person and let me tell you about that time that I like was introduced to their work," which, is fine. But this it's like you're just so into the Peter narrative and this almost just like yeah, it was so striking because it was suddenly like you could feel the surge of connection between the two of you. Would you mind reading that part?
About sure.
yourself
And
if you don't
yeah,
mind.
yeah, yeah. And I'll just kind of show the layout, which was it was such a fun zine to create because Mark and Jose from the Mattazine Society,
Yeah.
we would just get together and sit around a table with like scissors and like cutting up images of Peter or just, random things and really creating like a super fun layout and a great, like, fun, playful way of telling these stories.
Yeah.
So this is probably, kind of the most serious page, but I grew up with a critical mom telling me I was fat or a bad dresser. School wasn't better as I felt unseen or unappreciated. My looks were a foreign language those around me in St. Louis didn't speak. I always wanted to be thought of as beautiful, worthy of being photographed. This is something I had in common with Peter.
Do you remember discovering Peter's work for the first time?
Yes. Well, I remember the first images of Peter I saw, which David Wernerovich, who was briefly a lover and then a very good friend of Peter's, took photos of Peter right after his death. And those were the first images I saw. And they were startling just because we don't normally encounter photos of the dead.
Yeah.
And of course, someone, young, it was a death from AIDS related complications. But also what was also shocking was that I was attracted to him. That, it was uncomfortable, that discomfort of like, oh, that's a photo of a dead man. And
Mhm.
wow, that dead man, he is also attractive. There was something there that tension. I was, I feel like I was young. I don't know how old I was at the time. And so that's how it stood out to me. And then later learning more about him, Robert Mapplethorpe's work really kind of consumed uh, everyone's attention. And I
Yeah.
think there's this thing in the art world that there can only be one. And it was, kind of Robert and not Hujar. But I think now, it's great to see in the past 15, 20 years, like Hujar getting so much attention and so many shows and so many books and people focusing on his work. There's not a biography on Peter Hujar. And that's it's a shame, but hopefully with all this attention he's getting that someone's going to invest the time to do that because I think there's he lived quite an interesting, fascinating life. And I think people are hungry to learn more about him.
Do you think that's another project of yours?
No, definitely not. And I can tell you that. That's why I went to New York and I went to is it the Fales Library and New York University,
Okay.
went through David Wojnarowicz's archives, specifically thinking maybe my next project was going to be to write about Peter Hujar.
Okay.
And I spent about 2 to 3 days there, and I really just wanted to be running around the city. And though I had an interest, like I think it's a great idea, and I have interest, I realized I didn't have enough like steam for it. You know,
Mm.
David Acer, I did.
Yeah.
My other work that was very focused, I did. But for some reason, it just, it really is quite a lot of work. He wasn't someone who wrote essays or about himself. There aren't a lot of recordings of his. So it is a, it is a quite a labor for any biographer. And I've never written a biography
Yeah.
before. And yeah, so I don't. And so that's what's so great about this magazine zine is that I feel like I was able to like share Peter Hujar with people and also share like the ways I appreciate him and mention highlights of his life and little quirks that he had. Um and yeah, so this is, it's kind of, it is a love letter to Peter Hujar, wanting people to fall in love with Peter Hujar like I do, like I had.
This is I mentioned this when we were talking in person, but you know, um, Anais and David and Peter, right? You just it feels like you just have this like connection to the dead and like and and this is sort of an out there question and I'll say it again, but like is that something you've thought of before, right? Like you have some sort of like psychopomp quality. Like are people coming into your dreams like Stephen, write about us?
Um, no, I had never, who I think I'm so aware, I'd never considered that until you mentioned it. Part of it, though, is, in the case of Anais and Peter, they're artists, and so they seem so alive to me.
Yeah.
Like artists, we get to experience someone's work long after they're gone, and it's still so like vital and energizing. So maybe there's that. I don't know. I mean, they're both people that I think are deserving of even more attention.
Hmm.
Or I mean, I'm saying both of them. I mean, everyone. I've kind of written about, and what's my my forthcoming collection is about someone else who's passed. So I mean, I'm going to really think on that, and I don't. Yeah, I don't know what that's about. I mean, it's a really good question. Like, what's going on? I very rarely dream of the dead.
Okay.
When I do, it's always so. Um, I love it. It's like I get to spend time with people again. But generally, they're people in my own life. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's quite lovely. But I don't. I can't. I don't recall ever having a dream about Peter or David. I've had a couple Anais dreams, but nothing even vivid. So yeah, no, I don't have that, but I do feel some connection. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, from the outside, right, looking at your work, it's like, oh, this feels like this person like got their like cosmic marching orders early on, right? Like this sort of responsibility to like carry on the legacy of these people. And like from your perspective, does it ever feel like throughout this, like, oh, like somehow I have it's like my responsibility to do this. Like no one else is going to do. Like I have to, the weight is on me.
Oh, sometimes it does. Yeah, definitely with David
Yeah.
Acer, I felt that way. I really wanted the book to come out. Like that was one of those things. I didn't want it to sit and do nothing. I
Yeah.
really wanted to vindicate this man's life and legacy. Yeah, it feels like a responsibility. Although I think maybe other people feel that way. I think there are those things about like to not talk ill of the dead,
Hmm.
right? Like, what's that about? It's about wanting to promote the positives of the person that we loved or knew in our family. Although I think what's actually more loving is to honor the person as a whole.
Hmm.
And, in my forthcoming book, it's called Outliving Michael. And I think there are moments in the book that Michael doesn't look so great, or like Michael's flaws are apparent.
Yeah.
And that's me fully loving Michael, that I can honor him and love him and hold like the full personality and all the complexities of Michael. Um, so that these days feels really loving to me.
May I ask who this Michael is?
Oh yeah, Michael Church was one of my best friends, and he was over 20 years older than I was. And we hung out all the time together. I I briefly, and he died of AIDS, and I briefly tried to be his caregiver.
Hmm.
And it was that I was way too young, and it was also like a too much of a role reversal for us. And
Yeah.
that was hard too. And I also was young and had my own life. And, it was really challenging, but he had such an impact on me. And it kind of like filled that space of, if I learned so much about living life as an artist from Anais, like I learned a lot about living as a gay man for Michael. And, we spent Christmases together. And when I graduated, like he's the one I like had dinner with that night. So like he was such a big part of my life.
Wow. And this is something you're currently working on.
So the book is completed and it's going to be
Okay.
published by Moontide Press, and that's going to come out in probably about a year. Yeah.
It's interesting because both in For the Love of Peter Hujar and A Quilt for David, right? In both of those pieces, you get pieces of yourself, right? There's a way that you kind of insert your own story to help us get closer to those characters and who you didn't know, right? Like these are people you never spent time with.
Yeah.
But what was the difference writing about someone who was close to you and in that sort of scrutinizing of someone that you knew all their flaws, all their good parts? Was there maybe having to face your own flaws a little more because you were sort of part of that story too?
Yes, definitely. And um also it was so painful to look back. I mean, it was like personally, like it was so painful, but it's kind of what I experienced daily without Michael.
Hmm.
That's really where the title comes from, Outliving Michael. I was trying on a pair of shoes, like I'm at a store trying on a pair of shoes and
Yeah.
I was lacing them up. And for some reason I'd thought of him or thought about like shoes he used to wear. And then I quickly realized that I've outlived him in years. Like I'm older than the age Michael was when he died.
Oh, wow.
And so like those things are like big things happen in my life and I would love to tell him, or I would love to find out his opinion on it. I mean, he was full of opinions. So
Yeah.
like those things happen and I want to know, just I want to have that friendship back. I want to have Michael back. And so it's painful to
Yeah.
outlive someone. So, writing about it was a way of kind of staying in that pain, but also a way of like revisiting just the joy of being with Michael.
There are no parents, no other adults, no one to interfere with the fun.
That was the Muppet movie. And then
Yes,
the
the
one
first one.
you're talking about and I'm thinking of is the Great Muppet Caper, where
I
there's
think
like
that must be the great one.
three, right?
I just know it's the one where Miss Piggy breaks out of jail and they have like the diamonds. I think, or
Yes.
is that Muppets Take Man? Which is Muppets Take? Now, what happens in Muppets
No,
Take
Muppets
Manhattan?
Take Manhattan. They look at our memory for this. Like, see how like Muppets Take Manhattan. It has a cameo by Joan Rivers,
Okay. Oh
and
yeah.
they go like they're a band in Manhattan, I think, right? But the Muppet
I love
Caper,
this. You're
yeah.
like, oh, I don't know anything about puppets. And you're just like, so please,
I
let's go into the great Muppet caper here.
I do feel like Ralph. So they're going through like they're going to break in and steal the diamond back, or I can't remember what it was. And they're like, "Do you have the
Yeah.
rope? Do you have the tape? Do you what?" Like everyone's listing these like, "I have a ladder" or something, and Ralph is like, "I've got the paper towels." And then like I think he does it several other times in the movie, like where people they need help, and he's like, "I've got the paper towels," and he's like shaking the paper towel. And there's something so relatable about that, like we all want to contribute,
Hmm.
even if it's an inadequate contribution. And there's also hope that like maybe that contribution will, like save the day. I don't know. There's something about that still stands out in my memory about Ralph doing that.